that we use here at nScaled. We hope will give you some ideas about the best way for you to protect your Microsoft SharePoint environment. Without further ado, let me turn it over to you, Mike.
Good morning, afternoon, or evening to everyone attending right now. Thank you for attending this morning, or it's morning for me, so that's why I say that. I'm really excited to have everybody here. So let's kick it off and talk about SharePoint. A lot of environments have SharePoint. SharePoint's been one of the leading, intranet products out there. Collaboration, it's really evolved over time. A lot of environments have it. And it tends to be really business critical, and thankfully from a disaster recovery standpoint, it's actually pretty easy to deal with, even with the variety of configurations that you can have for SharePoint. It tends to be one of the easier products to protect and to provide DR for it. So without further ado, let's talk about what we're going to cover today. So we'll talk about the recovery options and the technology that we use here at nScaled to protect SharePoint. We'll talk about the different server roles that you typically see in a SharePoint environment and what that means to DR and your strategy there. We'll talk about minimizing your recovery time objective. So how do we get that RTO down as low as possible to make sure that our business continuity objectives are being met? We'll talk about multi-tenant SharePoint. How do you protect multi-tenancy? If you're a SharePoint provider and you've got multiple companies using your service, how do you protect that? How could you offer DR as a service for these customers of yours? We'll talk about testing and the importance of testing your DR. And then we'll talk about user access. So in the event of a disaster, how do you get your users to your SharePoint now that you've gotten it, off-site and in a safe place, and you've effectively got it running? How do your users get to it? So we'll cover all those topics, and let's kick it off by talking about the recovery options with nScaled. So with nScaled, we actually use block-level replication, and we replicate the data to a local appliance first using agents. It's actually called mirroring within your local site. We protect every server, every block locally. The local cloud appliance then replicates that data to the cloud. And in both locations, in your environment and in the cloud, we have full copies of every server. At the block level, they're quiescent and they boot. What that ultimately means is that you can actually recover a server locally. So on our local cloud appliance or in your current VMware environment, you can actually recover an entire running server in about 10 minutes. Let's say that you lost one role and you need to bring that server back online. You can recover that role in your environment within about 10 minutes using our software as a service console. It's really slick. It's a Web 2.0 console and allows you to recover it. You could be on vacation or out of the office and still recover a server in your office. So it's a great way to approach local recovery. And then in the event that there's a larger disaster, something that's bigger in scope, again, we have those copies of your servers off-site, and we have the compute resources in our cloud to drive your SharePoint environment, to make sure that everything is there, it's going to run, and we have all of the other pieces as well to make it work. We can make it work as similar as possible to your environment. We've got all the keys to that puzzle that you're going to need. There's three designs that I'm going to touch on today, and I'm going to talk briefly about roles. So the minimal design is that you've got a web front end. Whenever you see WFE, I'm talking about the web front end role in SharePoint. You've got the database server, and then you've got Active Directory. At a minimum, you have to have those three pieces. Active Directory is providing you with authentication. The WFE server, the web front-end server, is providing you with the actual web content. And the database server is where everything else goes, the configuration, the sites, the settings, the uploads. Most of the pieces go in there. And at a minimum, that's the basic design that you would have to have. In an HA design, however, which is the middle set drawing there, you can see that you can have, for high availability reasons, you can have multiple web front-end servers. You can have a database cluster. Obviously, Active Directory by itself, by nature, is multi-server and spreads out the data across multiple servers. You can also have an index server, and then you can also have a query server. So there's a lot of different roles that you can have in an HA design. SharePoint scales really well using this technique in this sort of an architecture. And then there's the multi-tenant design, where you can have a database cluster, for example, that drives multiple customers with arbitrary roles. So you might have one customer, for example, that's using the minimal design. They've just got a web front end and their own Active Directory. You've got another customer who's using their own index server, their own query server, and so they have a more complex design. But ultimately, you're driving it with the same database cluster, and that's usually to help you with licensing, for example, because you want to keep your licensing costs low with SharePoint or with SQL Server, rather, to make sure that the solution offering scales really well for multiple people and allows you to offer it at a competitive price. So we'll cover all disaster recovery for all three. So protecting the roles is actually pretty easy in SharePoint because the database is really the central repository for everything. So our technology, we actually get quiescent snapshots of the entire server, including the database. The way that it works is that the block level agent that's doing the mirroring makes sure that the file system is quiescent when a snapshot's taken, and it also makes sure that the SQL server is consistent. So the databases being protected are consistent at the time a snapshot's being taken. That means that when a server wakes up from a snapshot after some kind of event, it's consistent. It's going to work. It's going to boot. Windows isn't going to find bad blocks. SQL Server is not going to have problems with the database consistency. The web front-end servers are actually a pretty interesting case because if you have a really basic web front-end server, you actually don't really need to snapshot it all that often or even really retain a lot of snapshots because it doesn't change that much. You might even only retain daily snapshots or only replicate daily snapshots up to the cloud because the web front-end server is really just an engine that drives what users see. It's not typically a heavy-duty configuration server. That can be different if you've got multiple roles running on the same server, but typically the web front-end can be by itself, and it's usually a good way to go. In addition to backing up the index server using block-level technology, it's actually a really good idea to also use the built-in SharePoint tools to back up your index. So from the standpoint of disaster recovery, you would want to make sure to get that index backup off-site as well. In addition to backing up the index server, in addition to snapshotting it, it's a good idea to have the backup also on like another drive. So for example, you might have another drive on your index server that can receive the backup of your index. That way you can restore the backup of the index just in case. It's still faster than rebuilding the index. It's going to give you the better search results in the event of a disaster, and it's sort of a fail-safe just in case. What if part of the problem you were having with your SharePoint environment is that the index was corrupt or there's a problem with the index? It's always a good idea to back up your index anyway. And even in your disaster recovery plan, it's a good idea to have a backup of your index even though you're capturing the entire server. And it's also important to note that the query server, so there's actually an index server and a query server. The query server is sort of the search engine optimized server for your own environment. The query server actually can't be used to recover the index server. So if you have a query server that's separate from your index server, capturing the query server doesn't give you the ability to recover the index. It's important to remember that the index server has to be backed up and snapshotted ideally as a part of a sound design. So I can't emphasize enough how important local recovery is, and one of the key differentiators of the nScaled approach is that in most cases you're actually going to lose a server locally for one reason or another. Maybe it's a bad Windows update. Maybe the server has a hardware failure, the SCSI backplane fails. And you want to recover that server as fast as you can in your local environment. This is more of an everyday kind of disaster that you're really protecting yourself with nScaled. At nScaled, we like to think of ourselves as, hey, we're the company that's going to give you the offsite recovery. We're going to give you the ability to recover your servers in the cloud, but we're also going to give you the ability to recover from these basic disasters that happen that are more likely. So you're not just buying this sort of long-term insurance policy with nScaled where you're saying, hey, I'm going to recover the server in case something really bad happens. With nScaled's approach, you're getting local recovery as well. So those everyday disasters that cause the most havoc, you're actually protecting yourself with nScaled solution as well. Local recovery lets you activate a server in your local environment, either using the local cloud appliance as your compute, or you can use your existing VMware environment for compute resources as well to activate that server. You can also use it to not just activate the entire server, but just to recover data. Our solution, because we're capturing the entire server, you can actually mount a copy of that server to your workstation, for example, and copy data off of it from a point in time. So if you're keeping, let's say, 2 weeks worth of snapshots locally, and you need something from 2 weeks ago, you can recover that locally using your high-speed network in your workstation. It's as simple as dragging and dropping files from the image of the server back to your workstation or back to the source server, however you need to get that data back into your environment. And thankfully, remote recovery is just as simple. So using our SaaS console, you can actually recover an entire server or the entire SharePoint workload in the nScaled cloud. And even if something disastrous happened, you lost your main office, and you need to recover the entire SharePoint environment in our cloud, you can do that. It's a matter of just about 1 click per server, typically less than 15 minutes per any given server to come up. Your recovery time objective is really something that's deterministic with nScaled, and it gives you assurances that you're going to be able to run in the event of a disaster. We've also thought about everything that you need to think about in terms of disaster recovery. Most importantly, how do you get back to your environment? We've covered failback. Our solution covers how do you get your data all the way back into your environment. It's really important to go with a company that understands the end-to-end. Not only how do you fail over to the cloud, but how do you fail back? How do you get back into your production environment? So minimizing recovery time objective. The recovery time objective is a definition of how long you expect it to take to get your environment back up and running. And this is usually a business objective. And for the IT people in the audience, you know what sometimes happens when you have a business objective and then you have the technical reality of trying to meet that objective. It's not always the easiest thing to do. Those are not always easy things to reconcile. You might have somebody, I remember a discussion with a boss I had before where he said, you know what, Mike, I know that it gets more expensive the quicker the narrower that time is, but I really need to have this kind of a time. And coincidentally, that was when I was able to come to him with nScaled and say, look, you know, if you use nScaled technology, we can actually save money and get quick recovery. It's a huge benefit. So how do we minimize that window? How do we keep that window as short as possible? And the first thing that you want to do is have Active Directory running at your DR site. You actually want to have it set up in sites and services at your DR site running full time. You don't want to snapshot your Active Directory server and then replicate it offsite and then expect to fire it up in a disaster, because what's going to happen? You're going to have to recover that AD server, and it's not the easiest thing to do. And we've learned this from experience. That's why we developed our product around the quick recovery idea and the concepts behind quick recovery, and that includes having a live AD server running in your DR environment. It's really critical. Anything that you do to provide disaster recovery really has to have that running and working already, because it's just the fastest way to recover your environment. And keep in mind that I'm saying that just don't forget that I mentioned the Active Directory server, because I'm going to bring it up again, because there's another cool thing that you can do with Active Directory once you've got it on the other side, and we'll get to that when we talk about testing. The next thing you can do to minimize your RTO is to have NAT pre-configured. So as an example, if you've got another site and that other site has an internet connection, in the case of nScaled's cloud, we have internet access already configured. When we go through your disaster recovery plan with you, we predefine the NAT. We make sure that you're ready to go. The NAT points to the IP addresses that the servers are going to get when they come up in the DR environment. That way you know that that's ready to go. You know what the IP addresses are going to be. It's not like you're going to have a different IP address when you fire up in a disaster. So having your NAT pre-configured is kind of key. Another key is to drop the TTL of your A record for external DNS. So TTL is the total time to live for a record in DNS. And the idea here is that if you have, say, a 5-minute TTL, you know, the default is usually somewhere around a day. If you have a 5-minute TTL, that means that basically caching DNS servers on the internet won't keep that record in their cache longer than about 5 minutes. Now, some DNS servers don't follow that rule, but that's okay. As a general rule of thumb, this works very well. For your SharePoint environment, if you have your end users hitting it from the outside, then you would want to have that TTL record dropped as low as possible. That way, as low as reasonable, I should say. If you're paying per query, obviously 5 minutes might be a little bit too fast for you. But the idea being that you want to have a deterministic, like predetermined period when you can say, okay, we'll take 10 minutes for DNS to cut over once we change the A record. And the last piece is being able to test and practice your recovery. So a disaster recovery plan is only as good as its execution, and if you can't test its execution, then you really don't know how good your plan is or that it will work. And you need to be able to say to a straight face with the people who are giving you these recovery time objectives, I can do it in an hour, or I can do it in a half an hour, or I can do it in 2 hours. But knowing that you can actually meet the objective is kind of key. For multi-tenant SharePoint, so earlier I was talking about service providers. You know, if you're providing multiple SharePoint instances from multiple different customers, chances are your architecture is leveraging a database cluster on the back end. And this database cluster is serving multiple instances of SharePoint at the same time. For economies of scale, this makes the most sense because it gives you the most cost-effective way to deliver SQL, plus you're throwing good compute resources at the database side of things, and you can give people arbitrarily complex SharePoint environments. So if somebody needs multiple web front ends, they need an index and a query, whereas another client that's running off the same database only needs a web front end and they really don't need much else, or they might have multiple roles on that server. That's okay. You're providing that. But then if you're thinking about snapshot technology, you're probably saying, you know what, Mike, I hear what you're saying, but I've got like multiple customers in my database, and I don't want to snapshot the database server and then activate that database server in the cloud and have to sort out what kind of security am I dealing with, or issues am I dealing with, what kind of recovery time issues am I dealing with, because I have all of their data across multiple customers. I can't just send that to my customer, right? So let's talk about nScaled hybrid cloud in this case. The key of a hybrid cloud is that we can give you live running servers. They run 365 days a year. They're always on. How would you do a multi-tenant architecture with a live server? And the answer is that you set up log shipping. So you use SQL-based log shipping, and you ship only that customer's database to the cloud. They're running it as a server. Then it's just a matter of reconfiguring the WFE server to point to the database server in the cloud. And actually, those details can all be worked in advance. So it's not like you're going to be under the pressure of a disaster to figure that out. We have actually a testing mode that's built and designed exactly for this. So you would set up log shipping, get that one customer's data offsite, get that out of the replicating into a single standalone database server running full-time in the cloud. And then we can still give you the ability to test that. So testing. Testing is the most important part of disaster recovery. Without testing, you really don't know for sure that you can meet the objectives that have been set and really that it's practically going to work and that it's been documented. RT is really only talk without testing. Our test mode network at nScaled is designed for testing DR. And what we do is we take that Active Directory server that I was waxing poetic about earlier, how important it is to have a live Active Directory server running in the cloud. And we actually snapshot it in the cloud and then make it available to you in our test network. So you can take the latest version of your Active Directory server, activate it in the test network. That gives you all of your current accounts, gives you everything that you need to run your AD environment, but it doesn't talk back to your other AD environment. So you're really bringing up a copy of your AD environment in an isolated network and not letting it talk back to everything else. This gives you the ability then to fire up your servers, fire up your SharePoint environment, test it, make sure it works the way you expect it to, document it, document what your DR recovery procedures are, and then prove that you can execute it. One of the benefits of having a test mode network is that you can actually test your DR during business hours. If you haven't done DR testing before, or if you have, you know the pain, most of the time you end up testing with production systems offline so that you can actually test your DR. You've got your IT team doing the testing. You've got your application owners ready and waiting for IT to finish so that they can test the application and make sure that it really did work. And this is all very time-consuming. It's cutting into people's personal lives. You know, they'd rather be playing golf or spending time with their families on the weekends. And instead, with our solution, you can actually test during the day. You can test during the business hours. You can test during productive time when you've got the people already in the mindset of work and ready to go and test, and you don't need to take the production systems down. You can also use the test mode network for other things than DR. So for example, let's say that Microsoft has released a new version of SharePoint or a new version of SQL Server, and you want to test what would happen if I upgraded SQL. Like what do I need to be able to deal with if I upgrade SQL? So you bring up your environment in the test mode, test the SQL upgrade, see what happens. Test the SharePoint upgrade, see what happens. You can work through all of those details using your exact copies of your production systems, but without any of the risk to your production systems. Then again, you can plan out the execution of the upgrade before you actually do it. So this is leveraging DR for a lot more than DR. At nScaled, we really believe that every technology that goes into making DR work should be able to make other things work. And that's why we can make backup work and backup and recovery work, and we can also make testing for things other than DR work really, really well. So the final point that I want to talk about is user access. You failed over to another site. You've had some kind of disaster where you need to fail over to someone else's site. How do your users get there? And I can't emphasize enough how important hybrid cloud becomes at this point for disaster recovery. So with hybrid cloud, you get live servers. That's one of the things you can do. We have virtual appliances we can deploy to fill some other roles like load balancers. But you also get rack space. So name another cloud provider, for example, where you can get rack space. It's not necessarily easy to do. We can give you rack space. It's totally private, totally isolated to you. It's connected to your private network in our environment. And what this gives you the ability to do is provide, for example, let's say that you're using a Cisco VPN solution and all of your users already have the Cisco VPN client installed on their laptop. Then you could just set up another profile that's like the DR site. So you have your main VPN site that they use every day when they log in, and then you have your DR site. This is especially important for people, maybe they're in field sales, for example, and they need to be able to get back to the office. But in the event of a disaster, they want to know that it's easy to get to the disaster environment. It's also easier to test that way. So if you needed to rack hardware for VPN, you can. We also can provide you, however, with L2TP over IPsec-based access that's built into every operating system. We have instructions for Windows and Mac that give you the ability to use radius authentication to authenticate your users to get them into the DR environment for when, if you do have to activate in the cloud, even if it's in a test, you could do a real test and have people at home trying to access the systems. We can give you internet addressing and NAT. We have enterprise-class load balancers from Riverbed and WAN accelerators from Riverbed that you can include in your environment to make sure that the environment works the way that you want it to. So the key with disaster recovery with nScaled and what makes us different from a lot of other providers is that we're going to be able to help you replicate the closest user experience to the environment that they're used to as possible. That means if you've got load balancers and you need to have good load balancers, we have enterprise-class load balancers to give you. If you need user VPN access, let's say that you don't want to expose your SharePoint environment to the internet because it's not exposed that way in the first place, and you're thinking, gosh, in a disaster, I don't want to do anything different than what I do in my production everyday environment. That's what we're going to work with you to architect. We're going to make sure that, like, hey, you know what? If you don't let people into your SharePoint environment during normal practices, why would you let them in during a disaster from the internet just wide open? You want to make sure you've got some kind of security measures in place. So maybe that you have them VPN in. What about your remote offices? Maybe your remote offices, you don't have VPN, but they all have internet access. We can give you failover VPN tunnels that your central office is down, failover to the cloud. The VPN tunnel comes up and your users access SharePoint through the VPN tunnels from your remote offices. There's a lot of different scenarios that we can architect to make this work for you, and it's because of the flexibility of the hybrid cloud that gives you that flexibility to say, hey, I need to replicate as close as possible what my users are going to experience during a disaster so that they're comfortable and they know how to get to what they need. And with that, I'm going to open up the floor for questions. Andrew, has anything come in?
Yeah, Mike, thank you. So everybody, if you've got any questions, I'd like you to type them into the questions area of that GoToWebinar control panel that you see. So here's a question, Mike. Earlier you talked about the importance of coordinating the SQL Server and the index server, and I was wondering if you can go into maybe more detail about that. Is that a question of how the host agents that are doing the snapshots are configured, or is that a question of how the snapshot schedules are set? Just maybe a little bit more detail about that.
Sure, yeah. I mean, at the very least, you want to make sure that you're snapping the database server and the index server at similar time periods. So you're not going to re-index all the time, but you do want to make sure that, like, as the index is building, as content's being driven into the database, that the index server is getting updated as often as is reasonable. So snapshotting them and using the agents in a coordinated fashion so that the snapshot's being taken at the same time means you're going to have less headache when you wake up in the cloud. And then, like I said earlier, if you're backing up your index in addition to snapshot into the whole index server, that also gives you one further sort of safety parachute, if you will, to recover your index from a point in time, just in case the index was the thing that went bad in the first place, or that was one of the fallouts of the disaster, that your index server has an issue.
Okay. Let's see. Had a quick question here I already took care of. They wanted to know if they could get a copy of the presentation slides. So I guess you struck a nerve with the topic this morning, Mike. So awesome. That's always good. One of the things that, while I wait for other questions to come in here in our last few minutes, is I'll ask the audience if you have any thoughts about technical topics that you have questions about, or questions specifically related to the nScaled solution. Feel free to let us know. Send an email to info@nscaled.com if you've got, again, technical topics you'd like to learn more about. This technical series we've been running for the last few months, with this SharePoint presentation being the most recent, we've gotten good response to it, and we'd like to keep it up and focus on topics that are relevant to the audience. Well, Mike, I'm guessing you were so thorough that you answered everybody's questions. Oh, okay, here we go. Judy wants to know if we can talk a little bit about how our services are billed. Judy, it's a service-based pricing, monthly or annual contracts. Everything, including that appliance that Mike talked about that we put on your network, is billed as a service. There's no CapEx involved. The two main drivers of the pricing are how many servers you want to protect, and that's a per server per year fee, and then how many terabytes of storage you need to consume in our cloud data centers to store the snapshots. And that's something that obviously is driven by how much storage your servers use, and then also how many snapshots you want to keep for each server, how much of a history you want to keep, because obviously even with data deduplication, keeping more snapshots will increase the amount of storage that you need. Those are the two big ones. Of course, there's other things like a one-time implementation fee. And then, as Mike was saying at the end, we have the ability to rack any specific custom hardware that you want us to provide. And so there are additional fees for that. And obviously, we'd be delighted to get you talking to one of our sales reps to go into more detail about that. Well, we're just about out of time, and it looks like we're just about out of questions. So, Mike, thanks very much for all that information.
My pleasure.
And I want to thank our audience for taking the time this morning. And we'll be doing this again next month. Check your email inbox for the invitation to next month. And with that, we will wrap it up. Thank you, everybody.